Okay, so one of the first things I want to do is kind of clean up this logging that we have down here. So if you look here, we have like a lot of information, and usually I'm for a lot of information, but a lot of this is kind of filler. So imagine we're running like 1,000 tests, having all these lines of just kind of debug or information code coming through into the logs can kind of clog up the logs in general. So what we want to do is we kind of want to clean that up. So a couple things that we can do is to actually turn off the logging for certain things. So there's pieces of this that I don't really need information. So a lot of it's doubling up, like starting Chrome driver 98 is already being logged above by the WebDriver manager. So I don't really need that. The only thing I really care about is this Chrome driver starts successfully. And I might keep these WebDriver manager logs just for dexterity and be able to see what version number we're running. So to do that, we're going to go to our base test here, where we're initializing our WebDriver. Sorry. Basically, we're going to, above this, we're going to basically tell our WebDriver to be silent when it logs. So we'll do system dot set property. And then inside here, we'll do WebDriver dot silent output, I think. Yeah, that's right. And then we will do set true. So basically we want it to be silent. And what that's going to get rid of is basically this starting Chrome driver, only local connections allowed, and this please see this URL for suggestions. Next, we're going to get rid of this stamp date right here, the protocol create session, and the info. So we'll do that right below the system there. And we're going to do that using a job util logging. So we're going to do Java util logging dot logger dot get logger. And then inside there, we're going to say org dot open QA dot Selenium. And then after we'll do set level. And basically we're going to set the level of logging that we want out of it to off. And what we'll see here when I run this is that it'll actually now, we won't have this amount and we won't have this. So what we should have is 3 lines of info versus the 8 lines of info that we have. So let's run it, verify that's working now. Another improvement that I'd like to do is I don't want my local to be bogged down. I don't have a very strong machine, right? For example, let's say that I didn't want it to open all the browsers. Let's run it in headless mode. So basically headless mode is running Selenium through the API calls and not necessarily through the browser specifically. So what we can do is we can actually set our Chrome options to run headless, which means that it won't open the browser during the test and kind of bog down. It helps speed up tests, and performance wise, there are some drawbacks. Obviously, you're not going to get the same type of coverage as far as like being a realistic user going through the application, but there's other the benefit is that it runs faster, execution is faster, and that you know, less performance or better performance on your machine. So to do that, we're going to go down to Chrome options. We're going to do Chrome options dot add arguments. I'm going to simply just add an argument for running headless. Now you can do this for a lot of things. You can run this to disable your GPU. You can you can send it all different types of arguments, but today we're going to do headless. So we do -- headless, and that's it. So now when I run this, it's actually not going to open a browser. It's going to just simply run the steps headless. Next, I kind of want to focus in on what we need to do for our running parallel, right? Let's say I have a ton of tests and my execution time is like hours long. To be able to shorten that time period, you can run in parallel. You can run all the tests of parallelization. Now that's dependent on the strength and the power of the machine that's running, but at the end of the day, that's what you want to do if you want to increase your execution time without adding extra test agents or etc. So let's do that. Let's look at our code right now. Right now, our code isn't set up to be able to run parallel. So in test-ng, parallelization is pretty simple. It's actually pretty simple to set up to run parallel. It's actually pretty simple to set up running parallel. So parallel is basically just an attribute inside the test-ng file. So let's say we just write parallel. You can run a couple different ways in test-ng. You can run your methods in parallel, your tests in parallel. You can run your test suites in parallel. It's really dependent on the type of, or your classes in parallel. It's dependent on what your needs are. Today, we're going to run our methods because we're going to have a couple methods in our example class that we're going to run. And then you can also do what's called a thread count. So a thread count basically is telling the test-ng how many tests that you actually want to run in parallel. So now, remember, you don't want to, it's all dependent on the machine that it's running on. So you can't run a million of these or all your tests in parallel because your machine will fall down and there'll be a lot of timeout issues, right? Because everything will run too slow and the timeouts will be hit. So today we're going to do two because we're going to run two tests in parallel. But just be aware of that. Don't try to go crazy. Just find the best way to get to the closest as far as like what you can push the limits to. And then I would even suggest moving back one or two threads just so you don't always run the line of timing out. So I've simply set that to set. So if I were to run this right now, it wouldn't specifically, first of all, we don't have multiple tests. So I'm going to go in here. I do have a second test here, but that's our failing test from previous runs. So I'm going to just simply copy this one here. And we'll call this 2. So we have our test search page and our test search page 2. They're doing the exact same thing. So what will happen here is when I try to run this, it's going to try to run both of those in parallel. And we'll see what happens here. It's not set up currently to run in parallel, so that's why. So what happened there is that we ran into a couple problems, right? So one of our tests passed and it just skipped the other. And what happens is that we have multiple tests here, but we don't have our driver set up to be able to run in parallel. So we have to do this to our driver because without being able to do that, without having our driver set up to run in parallel. So basically we need to set it into a thread local. So that way it's isolated to each test. And we're going to do that right now. So what we need to do is we need to go to base test. And this is where we're initializing our driver. So we're going to take a look at how we're initializing the driver, right? So at the top, we are doing a web driver. And then we're just simply calling it a driver. We need to modify this a little bit and call it and set up a thread local. Oops. And then we'll set that up equal to a new thread local. And now what happens is our driver is now set up as an isolated thread. So when we set up and run multiple tests, each test will have its own isolated thread or local version of a driver. So as you can see, once you do that, you break a couple things, right? So if you obviously notice our driver we aren't able to instantiate our driver anymore down here because basically the call changes slightly. So I always think of this like you're updating something your driver basically just needs to be updated to either a driver.get or a driver.set. So to set our Chrome driver here, we need to, let's go below it. We need to do a driver.set. And then we're basically going to do what we were equals up here, right? So we'll do new Chrome driver, and then we're going to still pass in our Chrome options. So this is basically the new, the thread local version of this. So we don't need that anymore. So we're going to delete that. And then we'll do the same down here. So this is a little bit different. So we'll do driver.get this time, .manage, .timeouts, .implicitly wait, and then we'll set it at 10, and then our time unit to seconds. So again, very similar, right? Like we have our manager, or we have our, all we're doing is adding a get. So once we have that, we can delete the above. So we have driver.get, .manage, .timeouts, .implicitly wait, and then we're passing our wait time and setting it to a time unit of seconds. If we scroll down a little bit, we have a couple more issues here. So we need to, one, maximize our window, and two, set our URL property. So let's continue working our way down. So we have driver.get, .manage, .window, .maximize. So again, very similar, right? All we're doing is adding that get between manage and driver. Now the URL is a little bit differently. So we need to actually do a different call here. So before we could do, hey, driver.get URL, then we pass in the driver. This time we need to do it as driver.get .navigate .to, and then we're gonna grab our property from our config file, get property, and then URL. So fairly differently, right? So usually in a normal situation, we can call driver.get. This time we need to specify, we need to navigate to this specific URL. So we're gonna get rid of that. As you can see, we have a couple more errors in here from previous methods that we had set up. This is simply that we need to add .get after these, because now we're using a thread local version of the driver. So we need to make sure that we are passing that in and updating our other instances of our driver. Now I could probably do some version of thread local where it already returns a thread local.get instead of me going and updating this, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we will not be doing that. So I'm going to save here real quick. Now I'm going to check most of these. So let's remember our base classes where we have our before methods and our after methods. And in our after methods, we do have a close. So we need to do driver.get .close. Same with quit, we are calling. So we'll basically, I'm just going through and updating anywhere where we had the driver before, so that I can run it in parallel. Now, our page objects is obviously a key, right? We have our page objects where it's going to be using our driver. So we have a couple functions here that we need to update as well. Obviously, when you're architecting your framework, this is something you'd want to do early on. Otherwise, updating a previously created framework to run thread local might be a little challenging, unless again you did the method where you returned the thread local.get, so you don't have to update these to get. I think that is it. Let's see here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save all. And what we expect to happen is that we expect both of these to run. So if we go back to our tested G file, we do have parallel methods. They're targeting the example test class. So any methods inside that class should be ran in parallel up to 2. So we'll just simply hit run here. And as you can see, what happened there now is that one, our logging is now fixed, right? Our logging was combined before. I don't know if you noticed that, but our Chrome driver was started successfully. It was actually in one line because it was not properly handling it properly. But also both of our tests ran individually. So that is how you set up parallel testing.